Welcome back, everybody, to episode number 2 of this new thing that we're doing called Lensdays, where we talk about lenses. If you missed the first video, I will link it in a playlist in the description. I had a really good response to that. I'm glad you guys are excited about it. In this video, we're talking all about sharpness, but first I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, who are the awesome folks over at Wine Country Camera. Wine Country Camera produces the best filter holder system available. In fact, it is the only filter holder system with a workflow for combining a circular polarizer, ND filters, and graduated filters, and making adjustments without ever disturbing critical focus. Their Blackstone filters use vapor deposition coating techniques and fire-polished shot ultra-white glass that are designed for high-resolution detail without the color shift that you find in many neutral-density filters. This system uses step-up rings to attach to any lens, and for wider-angle lenses with no filter threading, they have a 150mm system with custom-designed lens attachments. This is the system for serious landscape artists. Right now, you can use the link in the description to save 20% off of anything in the entire store by using offer code AOP on checkout. Once again, that offer code is AOP, and I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Wine Country Camera for sponsoring another episode of The Art of Photography. So first of all, I want to say that I'm really happy with the response that I got on the first video that I did. You guys were awesome. You left me some great comments. There's a lot of great suggestions, requests, things you want to see. There's an enormous amount of enthusiasm. But as we get into Lensdays, I do want to make 2 points up front. First of all, with this series, I intend to be as brand agnostic as possible. In other words, I don't want to talk about just one lens manufacturer and say that they're the greatest thing ever, because the truth is, I firmly believe that every lens manufacturer has made some incredible lenses. And I also want to talk about older lenses, vintage lenses, stuff that was made like in the 19th century. And so this is going to be a really broad topic. In other words, the reason I'm saying this is just because, let's say that I'm talking about the Nikon 85mm f1.4e or something like that, and I'm saying it's great. That doesn't mean that I don't like the Canon lens, and unfortunately people get really territorial about brands somehow. Which brings me to point number 2. There will be trolling. And look, I get it. It's totally cool. Lenses, cameras, these are all an investment. And people, when they get invested in something, get a little bit territorial about it. I totally understand that. And that is not my intention, is to say that your stuff is not any good because what I'm saying is better. In fact, there are lenses that you love that I don't particularly care for. There are lenses that I don't particularly care for, but I respect the fact that others might get great results on those. This is all subjective in the end anyway. So my intentions are not to hurt anyone's feelings. And if I don't mention a particular lens that you absolutely love, it's not because I'm a fanboy of whatever it is that I'm talking about. And that's why I want to talk about being as brand agnostic as possible, and we're looking at lenses in the overall architecture of time and history. But in the constructive comments that I had, several people actually all asked the same thing, and that is, why, of all the characteristics that we talk about in optics, why is sharpness the defining factor? Everybody's always talking about sharpness. Sharpness is where the emphasis is. Well, part of the reason is because sharpness can be measured. We have a system for measuring it, and I'm going to talk about in a second. But if we can look at the sharpness and we can understand how sharpness, which basically comes down to contrast and how this works in a lens, we can start to tell some of the other characteristics of the lens as well. So we have MTF charts, and wait a second, before you get scared off, oh my gosh, you just mentioned MTF charts, this is going to get mathy and nerdy really quick. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to try to make this as accessible and as fun as possible, but if you understand how to look at an MTF chart, not only can it tell you things about sharpness and contrast and how a lens resolves, but if you learn how to read the chart, it can tell you things like maybe an indication of how the bokeh might look, or whether or not there's field curvature or astigmatism, or even focus shift, or even chromatic aberration. But even if you can measure sharpness, one thing that I've learned is, for whatever reason, this is still subjective. Sometimes I have talked about lenses that I find extremely sharp. People will call me out in the comments and say that's not sharp at all. Of course, you're looking at it YouTube with compression, but anyway, and then I've even had people go as far as to email me images that they think are much superior that I find really soft. But anyway, sharpness, unfortunately, can be subjective as well. Let me give you an interesting example here. This is the Sony 135mm f1.8 G Master lens. This was a lens that I had several opportunities to use this year, and I thought, I have to save my money and I must own this lens. For me, it's not so much the sharpness, although it is very sharp, but it's the way that it renders. It is one of the best portrait lenses that I've ever used. I really love this lens. However, I have colleagues, close friends of mine, that can't stand this lens because they think it's too sharp. sharp. I never thought something could be too sharp, but in both of their cases, they shoot a lot of stuff with models. And a lot of the models will see the images, and because it's so sharp, it brings out a lot of definition in the face, including blemishes. You can even see where makeup is poorly done sometimes. So yeah, I guess we are at a point where lenses could be too sharp. Which brings me to another point that you guys are going to get really sick of me making in every one of these videos, but it's something that I very staunchly believe in. Great photography is always going to beat lens quality or image quality. There have been incredible photographs that have been taken on very cheap equipment. There have been Pulitzer Prize winning photos that were taken on Kodak Brownie, so the two are not related. Lenses are awesome. I have an utmost respect for lens designers and the work that they do. I have a great appreciation of great lenses, but it is not going to be a magic bullet. It's not something that's going to make you a better photographer, and that's something that is always worth repeating. But the question was about sharpness, so how do we measure sharpness? Well, it comes down to contrast, and we use something called line pairs to measure sharpness, and you might have a set of lines that are just black and white, and what we're looking for that we define as sharpness is the definition between these two fields, between black and white. In an actual photograph, this is going to come down, for instance, if we look at typography. And so this is a photo of a poster, and you can see it that it's rendered sharp because there's a high definition between the letter and the background, for instance. We can also see this in any kind of detail, whether that's landscape, whether that's a still life, whether that's a portrait. It's what defines a face on a model, for instance. It's what defines texture in dark areas. This is how we measure contrast, and it's done by this very rudimentary method of using line pairs of black and white. Another thing important is the spacing between these line pairs. So for instance, it's one thing if you have 10 line pairs per millimeter. It's another thing if you have 20, 30, or 40. They don't always resolve the same depending on what lens you're using. So a very high contrast between these black and white areas is going to equate to high sharpness. When you have less contrast between black and white areas, this decreases the sharpness, and this is how it is measured. Lens manufacturers use what we call MTF charts. Now, MTF stands for Modulation Transfer Function. And think about that for a second. Basically, we're looking at how modulation is transferred. We're identifying that function. You don't need to know all that. What you need to know about MTF charts is this whole line pairing contrast identification is the basis of what we're looking at with an MTF chart. So an MTF chart basically is taking half of the lens. Since the lens is actually round, we assume that it will be symmetrical if it's centered correctly. And what we're doing is we are looking on the left-hand side of the chart at the center of the lens, and on the right-hand side of the chart, we are looking at contrast or sharpness at the furthest corner. So the way lenses work is they project an image, or we call an image circle, onto a surface. And this could be film, it could be a digital sensor, it could even be a camera obscura. And if we look historically before cameras, when we discovered what the camera obscura was, if you have a dark room and you have a pinhole in that room, it will project an image of the outside world upside down in reverse onto the wall behind you. Now, the nature of it being an image circle is that in the middle of the circle, or the middle of the lens, the middle of the projection, this is where light is always producing its maximum sharpness, and it's also at its brightest. As you move out towards the edges, light will start to fall off. We call this light fall off, or sometimes vignetting. And also we have the contrast start to fall off. So this means that things become less sharper as we move towards the corners. Now, the goal in lens design is to even this out as much as possible and get corner to corner sharpness as tight as you can. The reality is that it's never 100%. But either way, if we look at an MTF chart, and Nikon has a tremendous amount of documentation of how they produce their MTF charts, we use these line pairs that we talked about earlier. Now, we actually take two readings, and what we do is we flip the line pair actually to a 45-degree angle, and then basically invert that, and you're going to have two different types of line pairs that we're going to read. The first are known as sagittal, sometimes called radial line pairs. The other are meridial or tangential line pairs. And so what this is going to do is it's going to give us two readings that we're going to take at various points. Now, these are going to be plotted across the chart depending on how sharp they are. The sharper they are, the higher they are going to be on the chart. When they lose sharpness occasionally, they will be plotted slightly lower, but this starts to give you an idea of the characteristics of a specific lens with two different line pairings. This results in a graph, but there's a lot that we can start to read off of this graph, particularly when we have multiple line pair readings. So for instance, let's say that this first round was done with 10 line pairs per millimeter. Maybe we'll do another one at 20 line pairs per millimeter, another one at 30, another one at 40. What this starts showing you is resolution, because they're not all going to perform as high as the 10 millimeter. That is totally normal, but what this starts to tell us is how well it will perform at higher megapixel resolutions, for instance. Now, it's very easy to assume that there is an ideal of what you want an MTF chart to look like. You want everything to be smashed up as close to the top as possible and maybe fall off a little bit at the corners because you don't care as much about that. Well, let's look at another MTF chart that might make you think a little bit differently. So at first glance, this may look like kind of a mess. We have sagittal and meridial lines just kind of going all over the place, and particularly this bottom line, which is a higher resolution, but we see this dipped to an incredibly low contrast before it starts to actually come back up at the corners. Now, what this tells us is we might actually have a case where we have field curvature. If you're not familiar with field curvature, basically what this means, I think everybody's familiar with the idea of depth of field. So if you shoot at a wide aperture, for instance, f1.8, 1.4, 1.2, you have a very shallow depth of field. That means wherever your focus is, things in that focal plane will be in focus, everything else will be out of focus. We are assuming, though, that that plane of focus is flat across the lens, when in reality it's not. It actually might move in towards the camera a little bit or further away, and this is actually quite normal for lenses. Now, does this mean this is a bad lens? No, it just means that it's a lens that I probably wouldn't want to shoot a group of people with, or a fence, or the classic brick wall that people love to do in lens reviews. And by the way, if you're really curious of what this is the Leica 35mm f1.4 Summilux M ASPH. It's a good lens. So what else can we get out of an MTF chart? Well, generally speaking, if we are looking at sharpness and high contrast areas, and we are plotting that across the graph, then we can also tell something about the out of focus areas, or the bokeh of an image. Now, typically, the closer these lines are to one another, the better bokeh rendering you're going to have. Now, I would take this with a grain of salt. Bokeh is something that is highly subjective, and it's something that really only became something that people were obsessed with in probably the 90s, early 2000s, and so your opinion is going to vary widely depending on what your personal tastes are and whether this is something that you're into. I also think there's other factors that are really important that you don't necessarily see on the MTF chart. For instance, how smooth the lens elements are, so on and so forth. And so I have different testing that I do for this kind of thing. I don't really rely on the MTF chart, but it can kind of give you a general suggestion of whether or not it's going to be really busy bokeh or really smooth and creamy bokeh. It's also important to mention that there are characteristics that are not represented in any MTF chart. These include things like distortion, vignetting, lens flare, maybe even some types of chromatic aberration. These are just things you're not going to pick up. Plus, to make this more complex depends on how complex a reading you want on the lens. In the first video that I did in Lensdays, I talked a lot about one of my favorite lenses just because of its characteristics and what I find interesting, which is the Loxia 35mm f2. And that's a lens that starts to change dramatically, as most lenses will do, but this one is really dramatic when you start to stop down the aperture. What happens is typically MTF charts, if they're not defined, you can probably assume that they're being read wide open on the lens. In other words, at the maximum aperture. You can do MTF readings at smaller apertures, but the assumption is that when you tighten the aperture, you're going to even out the light and the contrast across the image circle, and therefore you're going to have just better sharpness. So why do we take MTF readings at the maximum aperture? Well, because it's at its most vulnerability. That is where the lens is going to expose the most flaws. And so to actually stop that down, and some lens companies actually do, you'll see separate MTF readings, and then we have just looked at prime lenses so far, and when you look at zoom lenses, it creates a whole nother equation because you have to do multiple MTF readings for each of the focal lengths. So for instance, if you have a 16 to 35 millimeter, it's going to read very differently at 16 millimeters than it's going to at 35 millimeters. In fact, it's usually sharper at its shorter distance at 16 millimeters, and it's a little bit softer at 35. And so this is actually interesting because if you're trying to decide, I want to shoot around 35 millimeters, but I want to have a zoom because I want more versatility, well, it's going to probably be the softest of the 16 to 35 readings, so maybe you want to be in the middle of the 24 to 70. You see where I'm going with this? The prime is probably going to be the sharpest, but you can expect that zoom lenses are just going to change over the focal range of the lens, and it becomes much more complex to show in an MTF chart. That being said, if you head over to Leica's website and you want to see what happens across the zoom range of any of their lenses, they will show you, and they are generally very impressive. Another thing that's important important to mention is, how is an MTF chart made? Now, this will vary widely from manufacturer to manufacturer. In fact, most lens manufacturers don't disclose how they take their MTF readings. You can assume that most of them are probably theoretical. In other words, we're producing lenses that theoretically will match this. They were not actually readings taken from a given lens. There are some companies that are very open about how they do their MTF chart readings. For instance, Zeiss is very open about the fact that they take theirs from actual product. And I think this is actually important because you're going to see a difference in the two, not to mention the fact that manufacturing a lens, there are lots of elements in here. There are lots of tiny parts. There's lots of precision that goes into that. Plus, you're designing something that is designed to actually focus, therefore it will move. So there is room for error. And so you're going to actually find what we call copy variation, which means that if I have 10 copies of the same lens, they probably won't all give me the same MTF chart reading in the end. Another resource that I would recommend if MTF charts are really important to you would be lensrentals.com. Now, Lens Rentals is a lens rental company in the US that rents not only lenses but other camera gear. They also have another business that they do where they do MTF chart readings. Roger Sakala is the owner of that company. He writes a lot on the blog, and with the lenses that they actually test 10 copies of, and the MTF charts that they post are averages of those 10 copies. So it's going to give you a much more real-world reading. But either way, any way you put this, I would never make an MTF chart the final decision of whether or not you're going to purchase a lens. It's just something that you're going to be able to get a little bit of information about the lens from. But the original question was sharpness, and if we can understand that sharpness basically is contrast, and there is a way to measure that, and if we can understand how to read those things, we can start to see a lot of characteristics about lenses. I know this was a very technical episode today, and I'm going to move away from this, but again, I need something I can refer back to if I bring up an MTF chart and somebody does not know how to read that. I don't want to explain that in every single video. If you have questions or comments, drop them below. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.